You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our Dinner and Dialogue gathering on August 19th, 2026. Thanks for tuning in. Have you ever had one of those days when you just feel slightly untethered from your own life? Like nothing necessarily catastrophic has happened, but you just feel off, Like maybe you've been moving too quickly, or maybe you've spent too much time reading the news, or maybe you've had 6 conversations that all required something from you, or maybe you've been chasing littles around all day and just have no gas left in the tank, or maybe there's some uncertainty hanging over your life that you can't resolve. Or maybe your brain has simply just decided that 2:30 in the morning is the appropriate time to revisit every unresolved problem you've had since 1997. And you can feel it happening, right? You know what I mean? Like your attention gets scattered, your body tightens, your thoughts speed up, you become reactive, and things that normally wouldn't bother you suddenly start to bother you, and you lose your footing a little bit. And when that happens, we human beings have developed all kinds of ways of responding. Some of us start trying to solve everything. Some of us start worrying about everything. Some of us get busy. Some of us withdraw. Some of us start scrolling. And some of us maybe just turn on Netflix and allow it to politely ask us 4 hours later, "Are you still watching?" I don't need this judgment from you, Netflix, And I'm actually not interested in criticizing any of that tonight, right? Sometimes distraction is exactly what our nervous systems need. But I've been thinking about this experience of losing our footing as it relates to turning toward the sacred. Because we use that kind of language all the time. Something happens and we say, "I feel ungrounded," or "I need to get my bearings," and "I don't know which way is up," or "I need to find my footing," There's something almost instinctive about the metaphor. When life becomes uncertain, we start looking for something solid underneath us. Isn't that fascinating? And for a long time, I think that's what I thought spirituality was supposed to provide. Solid ground, certainty, something underneath everything else that doesn't move. The right beliefs or the right theology, the right understanding of God. Something certain enough that even when everything else changes, I can plant my feet there and say, at least I know this for sure. But the older I get, the less convinced I am that sacred ground and solid ground are the same thing. Because life doesn't seem particularly interested in remaining solid. Everything changes. Our bodies change, our relationships change, our beliefs change, people we love change, we change. So what if the spiritual invitation isn't to somehow find the one piece of ground beneath us that will never move? What if sacred ground means something else entirely? There's this ancient story about a man who wasn't looking for sacred ground at all. He wasn't praying, he wasn't meditating, he wasn't on a pilgrimage somewhere. He wasn't even having a particularly spiritual day. Moses was at work. He was tending sheep in the wilderness, and then something catches his attention. He sees that a bush is burning, and that somehow this bush wasn't being consumed by the flames. So Moses did one very simple thing. He stopped and he turned aside, and that's when he heard the voice. "Take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy ground." And I've been wondering this week as I was prepping for this talk, whether the most important word in that sentence isn't holy, maybe it's standing. Because the transformation in the story isn't that ordinary ground suddenly became sacred. It's that Moses, in this moment, notices. He turns aside, and he becomes available to what's already happening. And maybe that's what finding sacred ground actually means. Maybe the question isn't, where is the sacred place? Maybe the question is, what helps me feel the ground beneath my feet? What helps me become present enough to encounter the life that's actually here? Because perhaps a sacred ground for our lives is less a place we find and more a way we learn to stand. And I think that's important because many of us inherited a version of spirituality that suggested God was somewhere else. God was in church, God was in heaven, God was in the Bible, God was in the Christians only. God was in some extraordinary religious experience that we're supposed to have. And if we could just find the right church or believe the right thing or pray the right prayer, have the right experience, then maybe we'd finally find solid ground. But I'm not sure faith gives us solid ground in that sense. In fact, life seems determined to prove otherwise. The person I was 20 years ago isn't exactly the person standing here tonight. So I'm increasingly suspicious of spiritualities that promise us a foundation where nothing ever moves. So maybe sacred ground isn't the place where nothing changes, but rather maybe sacred ground is the place from which change becomes possible. If you think about actual ground, soil isn't static, it's alive. Things grow in it, things die in it, things decompose, and roots move through it, and water passes through it, and tiny organisms are constantly transforming it. An entire invisible ecology is happening beneath our feet. Ground isn't dead stability, ground is generative. It holds life precisely by allowing transformation. And that feels much closer to how I have come to understand God, not as the great immovable object somewhere outside the universe keeping everything exactly where it belongs, but as the sacred depth within life itself, continually calling, inviting, luring the world toward greater beauty, greater connection, greater possibility. Sacred ground doesn't prevent becoming. Sacred ground makes becoming possible, which makes me wonder if being grounded means something different than we usually think. We often use that word to mean calm, right? Like, I'm feeling really grounded. Usually we don't mean, I'm so grounded that I'm sobbing uncontrollably in my car, What we mean is centered, peaceful, regulated, and those are wonderful things. But I'm also not so sure groundedness is always calmness. I think sometimes grief grounds us, sometimes anger grounds us, sometimes heartbreak can ground us. Sometimes somebody finally telling us the truth grounds us. Sometimes we finally admit, what's really going on. I'm exhausted, or I'm lonely, or I'm furious, I'm afraid, I don't know what I'm doing. And strangely, that moment of honesty can be more grounding than all our attempts to feel peaceful. Because groundedness isn't necessarily the absence of disturbances in our lives. Groundedness is sacred contact with what is real. And that's an important distinction for those of us who are contemplative folks. The purpose of meditation isn't to become less affected by life. The purpose of prayer isn't to float 3 inches above our problems. The purpose of spiritual practice isn't to become so peaceful that nothing bothers us anymore. If anything, contemplative practice should make us more available to life, more available to beauty, more available to grief, more available to another person's suffering, more available to our own bodies, more available to the earth, more available to love, or more available to whatever is trying to emerge in this moment. So perhaps one question worth asking ourselves is, what makes me more available to my life rather than less affected by it? I could sit with that one for a long time. For some of us, maybe it's prayer or meditation, or walking or weightlifting, or making music or painting, or sharing a meal around tables like these ones. Or maybe it's a person, the kind of person around whom you don't have to perform, and somehow after an hour together, you remember who you are. The point is to find sacred people and practices where you can learn to bring loving, conscious union to what is, to find those pathways to be more available to life, instead of more tuned out. We sometimes talk about needing an anchor, but I'm more interested in roots. An anchor keeps us from drifting, but roots hold us while also nourishing us. They also reach outward, connecting a tree to the soil and to an entire web of life. A tree is grounded precisely because it's deeply related. And maybe that's how humans work too. Maybe being grounded means knowing what we belong to. what relationships nourish us, what practices return us to ourselves, what stories remind us of who we are, and what places are places where we can tell the truth. Which brings me back to Moses, actually. I've been wondering what happened after he walked away from that burning bush. Did he spend the rest of his life trying to get back to it? Did he put up a little sign that says God appeared here? Did he build a shrine and spend 40 years trying to recreate that experience? No, right? He actually walked away and went back to the tasks and life ahead of him. So maybe the real gift wasn't that Moses discovered one sacred place. Maybe the burning bush taught Moses how to see with renewed eyes. Maybe once you've learned that the sacred can appear in an ordinary wilderness, on ordinary dirt, the whole world starts looking different. So tonight, the invitation might be very simple. We talked at the outset about those times we have all had where we feel off, where we feel scattered and sped up and like we're moving unconsciously. In those times, we ask, what can we do to reground? We can begin by feeling our feet on the ground. We are invited to notice what is here, notice what is true, notice what we're feeling, notice who is beside us, notice what makes us more alive, notice what brings us back when we've wandered away from ourselves. And then we can nurture those roots, return to those practices, call those people, walk those paths, sit underneath those trees, tell the truth about your grief. Let yourself experience and relish in your joy, not because any one of those things magically contains the sacred, but because they may help make us available to the sacred depth that is already moving through everything. Finding a sacred ground is about learning how to stand differently right here, to become rooted enough that we can remain open, present enough that we can respond, grounded enough that we can keep becoming. Perhaps finding a sacred ground is really about becoming people who know when to turn aside, feel the earth beneath our feet, and embrace our beautiful, messy, actual lives. All right, I'm so looking forward to talking about this with you all tonight. So here are our 3 contemplative questions for conversation. The first question is the self question. Where in your life right now might becoming grounded mean accepting what is real rather than trying to change or escape it? Number 2, the sacred question. What changes for you if sacred ground isn't where nothing in your life moves, but where change and becoming are welcomed? And lastly, the society question. If we are grounded through relationships rather than independence, what kinds of relationships do we need more of in our world right now? Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, visit www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.